Imagine Europe's most notorious dictator and its most powerful communist leader secretly agreeing to carve up entire countries just before plunging the world into war. Picture a devout Christian king forming an alliance with the Ottoman Sultan, a leader many in Europe considered the ultimate enemy. And then, get this, the staunchly anti-communist president of the United States flying to Beijing to shake hands with a revolutionary communist chairman, completely upending global politics. Number 8. These two nations have been beefs for so long, it's actually wild. Way back in 1373, England and Portugal signed a piece of paper. It wasn't just any paper, it was the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty, and it basically said, "We've got each other's backs." This treaty was later beefed up by the Treaty of Windsor in 1386. And guess what? It's still technically in force today, making it the oldest active alliance in the world. 600 years is a long time for any friendship to last, especially between countries which usually switch partners faster than celebrities. So, why did these two even team up? Well, back in the 14th century, Portugal was a plucky kingdom trying to stay independent from its bigger neighbor, Castile, which would later become part of Spain. England, on the other hand, was often at odds with France, and Castile was usually buddy-buddy with the French. So England and Portugal looked at each other and thought, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Plus, England's John of Gaunt, a fancy royal dude, had his own claims to the Castilian throne, and Portugal was happy to help with that if it meant keeping Castile off its own back. King John I of Portugal married John of Gaunt's daughter, Philippa of Lancaster, sealing the deal with a family tie. Over the centuries, this alliance saw some serious action and some serious weirdness. English archers helped the Portuguese win a super important battle against Castile at Aljubarrota in 1385, which pretty much secured Portugal's independence for a good while. Fast forward a couple of hundred years to the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. When Napoleon's French armies invaded Portugal, the Portuguese royal family literally packed their bags and sailed to Brazil, their colony, under British naval protection. British troops, led by the Duke of Wellington, then fought tooth and nail on Portuguese soil to kick the French out. There were, of course, moments when things got a bit awkward. Like when England became Protestant and Portugal stayed very Catholic. Or during the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, when Britain issued an ultimatum in 1890, forcing Portugal to give up some territory in Africa that connected their colonies of Angola and Mozambique. That definitely wasn't a high point for the friendship. Portugal was quite understandably very upset. But still, the alliance creaked on. During World War I, Portugal, after some hesitation, joined the Allies alongside Britain. In World War II, Portugal was officially neutral, which was a bit of a tightrope walk. However, in 1943, Portuguese leader António de Rute Salazar did allow the Allies, including Britain, to use vital air and naval bases in the Azores Islands in the Atlantic. This was a huge help in fighting German U-boats. Even in more recent times, like the Falklands War in 1982 between Britain and Argentina, Portugal once again allowed the British to use that Azores base. So, through thick and thin, royal marriages, religious splits, colonial squabbles and world wars, this incredibly long-lasting pact has somehow endured. It helped shape Portugal's ability to maintain its independence and explore the seas, and it gave Britain a consistent, if sometimes smaller, friend on the European continent. It's a bit like that old couple you know who've been together forever. They might bicker, but they stick it out. Number 7. When Viking raiders became French nobles and changed England forever. Imagine this. You're a king, and these terrifying Viking dudes keep sailing up your rivers, burning towns, and generally making a mess of your kingdom. You fight them, you pay them to go away, but they just keep coming back. This was the situation for Charles the Simple, king of West Francia, what would later become part of France, around the year 911. The Vikings were the nightmare of Europe. One particularly persistent Viking leader was a guy named Rollo. We don't know for sure if he was Danish or Norwegian, but we do know he was big, tough, and very good at leading raids. He and his crew had been causing major headaches for Charles, even laying siege to cities like Paris and Chartres. Charles was probably tearing his hair out wondering what to do. Then Charles had a pretty radical idea. Instead of constantly fighting Rollo, what if he made a deal with him? After a Viking defeat at the siege of Chartres, Charles decided to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte. Terms were pretty astonishing for the time. Charles offered Rollo a large chunk of land in the north of his kingdom, around the lower Seine River. This area was frequently attacked by Vikings anyway, so Charles might have figured, if you can't beat 'em, get 'em to guard your borders for you. In return for the land, Rollo had to do a few things. First, he had to stop raiding West Francia. Second, and this was a biggie, he had to protect the kingdom from other Viking raiders. Think of it like hiring the toughest guy in the neighborhood to be your bodyguard. Third, Rollo and his men were expected to convert to Christianity and recognize Charles as their overlord. Rollo became a vassal of the king. Rollo agreed. He was baptized, though some stories say his conversion wasn't super sincere at first, and the land he was given became known as Normandy, literally land of the Northmen. Rollo became the first Duke of Normandy. His Vikings settled down, married local women, and gradually adopted the local language and customs, becoming the Normans. They were still fierce warriors, but now they were Christian, French-speaking, and part of the Frankish political system, sort of. This deal had huge consequences that nobody at the time could have fully predicted. Firstly, it largely worked. Viking raids on that part of Francia decreased because Rollo and his descendants were pretty good at their job of guarding the coast. Normandy became a powerful and well-organized duchy. The Normans didn't lose their taste for adventure or conquest, though. And here's the kicker that changed England forever. About 150 years later, in 1066, one of Rollo's direct descendants, a certain William, Duke of Normandy, looked across the English Channel. He thought he had a claim to the English throne, so he gathered his Norman knights, sailed to England, and won the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror, a descendant of Viking raiders given land in France, became King of England. This Norman conquest profoundly transformed the English language, culture, aristocracy, and England's relationship with continental Europe. All because a Frankish king decided to make a deal with a troublesome Viking chief instead of just fighting him. Number 6. When Greek city-states teamed up with their old arch-enemy. Ancient Greece wasn't one big happy country. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states, and two of the biggest players were Athens and Sparta. Athens was a naval power, a democracy, for some of its people anyway, and very into art and philosophy. Sparta was a land-based military machine, ruled by kings and famous for its tough, no-nonsense soldiers. These two were rivals, big time. Their rivalry boiled over into the Peloponnesian War, a massive conflict that lasted for nearly 30 years, from 431 to 404 BC. It was a brutal, drawn-out affair that dragged in almost every Greek city-state on one side or the other. Athens had a powerful navy and a wealthy empire. Sparta had the best army. For a long time, neither side could get a decisive edge. Now, who was the traditional arch-enemy of all the Greek city-states? That would be the Persian Empire. Persians had tried to conquer Greece a couple of generations earlier. Think Battle of Thermopylae and the 300 Spartans. The Greeks, in a rare moment of unity, had managed to fight them off. So Persia was the big bad, the outsiders everyone loved to hate. But wars are expensive, especially long ones. Sparta, despite its military prowess, was struggling to match Athens' naval power and vast resources. Athenian ships could raid Spartan coastlines and keep their own city supplied, even when Spartan armies were camped outside Athens' walls. The Spartans realized they needed a fleet, a big one, and money to pay for it. But where would they get it? Enter Persia. Persians, still smarting from their earlier defeats, saw an opportunity. They weren't too keen on a single dominant Greek power, whether it was Athens or Sparta. A divided, squabbling Greece was much better for them. So the Persians, particularly through their satraps, governors, in Asia Minor, like Pharnabazus and Tissaphernes, and with the backing of the great king Darius II, decided to play kingmaker, or rather war financer. The Spartans, despite their pride and their history of fighting Persia, decided to hold their noses and make a deal. The defenders of Greek freedom allied with the very empire they had once fought so hard to repel. It was a shocking turn of events for many Greeks. The deal was basically this. Persia would give Sparta money, lots of it, to build and man ships. In return, Sparta would agree that the Greek city-states in Ionia, on the coast of modern-day Turkey, which Athens had liberated from Persia decades earlier, would return to Persian control once Athens was defeated. This alliance was a game-changer. With Persian gold, the Spartan commander Lysander was able to build a formidable fleet. He was a cunning admiral and managed to decisively defeat the Athenian navy at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC. This cut off Athens' grain supplies, and the city, starving and exhausted, was forced to surrender in 404 BC. Sparta had won the Peloponnesian War. The victory came at a price. They had effectively sold out other Greeks to their old enemy. The alliance with Persia didn't last forever, of course. Once Athens was out of the picture, Spartan and Persian interests soon diverged, leading to new conflicts. That temporary, deeply unlikely partnership between the super Greek Spartans and the barbarian Persians was what finally tipped the scales in one of ancient Greece's most defining wars, shifting the balance of power and paving the way for new struggles and eventually the rise of Macedon. Number 5. The Catholic cardinal who sided with Protestants to smack down other Catholics. The 30 Years' War, which raged from 1618 to 1648, was one of the most brutal and destructive conflicts in European history. It started as a religious war, a massive clash between Catholic and Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire, which was mostly German-speaking lands. But it quickly got way more complicated, with countries jumping in for reasons that had more to do with power and territory than just religion. France, at this time, was a Catholic kingdom, ruled by King Louis XIII. But the real power behind the throne was his chief minister, Cardinal Armand Jean du Plessis, Duke of Richelieu. Yes, a cardinal of the Catholic Church. You'd think Cardinal Richelieu would be all about supporting the Catholic side in the 30 Years' War, which was led by the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, a member of the powerful Habsburg family. The Habsburgs controlled not only the empire, but also Spain, another staunchly Catholic power. But Richelieu was a pragmatist. He was more concerned with the power of France than with religious solidarity. He looked at the Habsburgs, who practically surrounded France, and saw a major threat. If the Habsburgs won the 30 Years' War and crushed Protestantism in the empire, they would become overwhelmingly powerful, and France would be stuck between a Habsburg rock and a Habsburg hard place. Richelieu's motto was raison d'etat, or reason of state, meaning the interests of the state came first. So, in a move that must have made some people's heads spin, Catholic France, under the guidance of a Catholic cardinal, started to support the Protestant side against the Catholic emperor. At first, this support was sneaky and indirect. France provided money subsidies to Protestant powers like Denmark and crucially Sweden, led by its brilliant warrior, King Gustavus Adolphus. Swedish armies, funded partly by French gold, won a series of stunning victories against the imperial forces. Richelieu was playing a long game. He wanted to weaken the Habsburgs without getting France directly involved in the fighting for as long as possible. He even made alliances with Protestant princes within the German states. This was a pretty radical idea, a high-ranking official of the Catholic Church actively helping heretics fight against the leading Catholic monarch of Europe. It showed that, by this point in history, national interest was often more important than religious loyalty for many rulers. Eventually, after Sweden's momentum slowed, especially after Gustavus Adolphus was killed in battle, Richelieu decided France had to jump in with its own troops. In 1635, France formally declared war on Habsburg, Spain, and then on the Holy Roman Emperor. So now you had Catholic French soldiers fighting alongside Protestant Swedes and Germans against Catholic Austrians and Spaniards. Confusing, right? This French intervention significantly prolonged the war, but also changed its trajectory. France's fresh resources and armies helped to wear down the Habsburgs. Richelieu himself died in 1642, and Louis XIII died a few months later. But their policy was continued by Richelieu's successor, Cardinal Mazarin. When the war finally ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the Habsburgs were significantly weakened. The Holy Roman Emperor lost much of his power over the German states, which gained more autonomy. France, on the other hand, emerged from the war as the dominant power in Europe. This shift in the European balance of power was a direct result of Cardinal Richelieu's seemingly bizarre but ruthlessly logical decision to ally Catholic France with Protestant forces. It fundamentally reshaped the political map of Europe for centuries to come. Number 4. The most Christian king and the infidel sultan became unlikely buddies. In the 16th century, Europe was a place of big rivalries. One of the biggest was between King Francis I of France and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V was an incredibly powerful dude. He wasn't just emperor, he was also King of Spain, and he ruled over lands in Italy, the Netherlands, and even the Americas. Francis I found his Kingdom of France practically surrounded by Habsburg territories, ruled by Charles. They were constantly fighting over land, especially in Italy. Now, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, another mighty empire was on the rise, the Ottoman Empire, led by the formidable Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The Ottomans were Muslim, and for centuries various Christian European powers had seen them as a major threat, the infidel at the gates. Pope often called for crusades against them. The Habsburgs, whose lands in Austria bordered Ottoman territory and Hungary, were particularly on the front line against Ottoman expansion. So you'd expect Francis I, who proudly called himself the most Christian king, to be firmly on the side of his fellow Christian ruler, Charles V, when it came to dealing with the Ottomans, right, wrong. Francis I was a lot like Cardinal Richelieu would be a century later. He cared more about the power of France than about a united Christian front. He saw Charles V as his main enemy, And he figured, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if that friend was the Ottoman Sultan. Starting in the 1520s, Francis I began to make secret diplomatic overtures to Suleiman the Magnificent. This was scandalous. The idea of a major Christian king allying with the Turks against another Christian ruler was shocking to many in Europe. After Francis I was defeated and captured by Charles V at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, the French, desperate to find allies, intensified their efforts. The result was the Franco-Ottoman alliance, a series of agreements and collaborations that lasted on and off for several decades. It was never a formal, publicly declared treaty in the way we think of alliances today, more like a strategic understanding. What did it involve? Well, for one thing, military coordination. The French and Ottoman fleets sometimes operated together in the Mediterranean against Habsburg shipping in coastal towns. In 1543, a joint Franco-Ottoman fleet even attacked and captured the Habsburg-controlled city of Nice, though the citadel held out. The Ottoman fleet was then allowed to winter in the French port of Toulon, which caused a huge outcry. The cathedral was even temporarily converted into a mosque. There were also trade benefits. French merchants got favorable trading rights within the Ottoman Empire, which was a big economic plus for France. Politically, the alliance put immense pressure on Charles V. He now had to fight wars on two fronts, against France in the west and against the Ottomans in the east, who were pushing into Hungary and even besieged Vienna. This stretched his resources and attention thin. This alliance was highly controversial. Charles V and other critics accused Francis I of betraying Christendom. Francis tried to justify it by saying he wasn't allying against Christianity, just against the excessive ambition of Charles V. But for many, it was a deeply cynical and unholy partnership. Franco-Ottoman cooperation wasn't always smooth, and it had its ups and downs, depending on the political situation. But it fundamentally altered the power dynamics in 16th century Europe. It helped France survive and resist Habsburg dominance. It also gave the Ottoman Empire a foothold and a degree of legitimacy in European diplomacy, treating it as a player in the European power game rather than just an outside threat. This unlikely pairing between the French king and the Turkish sultan showed that geopolitics could be a very strange bedfellow maker indeed. Number 3. When Mr. Anti-Communist flew to Red China and changed the world, Richard Nixon. The name probably brings a few things to mind: Watergate, Cold War, and a very strong, very public stance against communism. Nixon built much of his political career on being a tough anti-communist. He'd made his name in the late 1940s and 50s chasing down alleged communists in America. The People's Republic of China, meanwhile, founded in 1949 under Chairman Mao Zedong, was the world's largest communist state. And for over 2 decades, the United States didn't even officially recognize its existence. The US recognized the exiled government in Taiwan as the real China. The two countries were bitter enemies, having even fought against each other indirectly in Korea and Vietnam. So, the idea of Richard Nixon, the staunch anti-communist president, suddenly cozying up to Mao Zedong's communist China, it sounded completely bonkers, impossible even. Yet, that's exactly what happened. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the world was a complicated place. The US was bogged down in the Vietnam War. Its relationship with its other big communist rival, the Soviet Union, was tense and locked in a dangerous nuclear arms race. China, too, had its own problems. It had gone through the chaotic Cultural Revolution, and its relationship with its former communist big brother, the Soviet Union, had soured dramatically. They even had armed clashes along their border. Mao and Chinese Premier Zhao Enlai started to see the Soviet Union as a bigger, more immediate threat than the US. Nixon, along with his brilliant and ambitious national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, saw an opportunity. What if they could use China to gain leverage over the Soviet Union? What if opening up to China could help the US find a way out of Vietnam? It was a bold, almost unthinkable strategy, often called triangular diplomacy, playing China and the Soviet Union off against each other. The process began in secret. Messages were passed through third countries like Pakistan and Romania. There was even ping-pong diplomacy in 1971, when the American table tennis team was surprisingly invited to visit China. A small, quirky signal that something was up. Then, in July 1971, Kissinger made a secret trip to Beijing to meet with Zhao Enlai and lay the groundwork. Later that month, Nixon stunned the world by announcing on television that he would visit the People's Republic of China the following year. In February 1972, Richard Nixon landed in Beijing. The images were historic. The American president, famous for his anti-communist rhetoric, shaking hands with Zhao Enlai, and later meeting with the aging revolutionary leader, Chairman Mao himself. It was a week of intense discussions, banquets, and carefully choreographed public appearances. The visit culminated in the Shanghai Communique, a carefully worded document where both sides acknowledged their differences, especially over Taiwan, but agreed to work towards normalization of relations. The impact was immediate and massive. It didn't end the Cold War overnight, but it completely reshuffled the deck. The Soviet Union, worried about a potential US-China alliance against them, became more willing to negotiate with the US on arms control, leading to the SALTI Treaty and other issues. The opening to China also helped the US extract itself from Vietnam, as China put some pressure on North Vietnam to negotiate. For China, it meant an end to its international isolation. In 1971, even before Nixon's visit, but as relations thawed, the People's Republic of China was finally admitted to the United Nations, taking Taiwan's seat. Over time, the opening to the West also paved the way for China's economic reforms and its rise as a global economic superpower. Nixon's visit to China was a gamble. For a politician known for his anti-communism, it was a huge risk. But it was a masterstroke of realpolitik, a decision based on practical national interests rather than ideology. It demonstrated that even the bitterest of enemies could find common ground when their strategic interests aligned, and in doing so, they could redraw the map of global power. Number 2. When capitalists and communists teamed up to save the world, temporarily. Picture this. On one side, you have the United States of America, the world's leading capitalist democracy. On the other, the Soviet Union, the world's first and largest communist state, ruled by an iron-fisted dictator, Joseph Stalin. These two countries had fundamentally opposing ideologies. They believed in completely different ways of organizing society, government, and the economy. The US had even refused to officially recognize the Soviet government for years after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Many in the West saw communism as a dangerous threat to freedom and democracy. The Soviets, in turn, saw capitalism as an exploitative system doomed to collapse. They were, in many ways, natural enemies. Then came World War II. In the late 1930s, Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, was on the rampage in Europe. Fascist Italy and Imperial Japan joined Germany to form the Axis powers. They were conquering countries, promoting ideologies of racial supremacy, and threatening to dominate the entire globe. Initially, the US was officially neutral, though President Franklin D. Roosevelt was deeply concerned by Axis aggression and began to provide aid to countries fighting Germany. Like Britain, the Soviet Union, surprisingly, had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1939. More on that shocking alliance later, which allowed Hitler to invade Poland without fear of Soviet interference, effectively starting the war in Europe. But everything changed on June 22, 1941. That's when Hitler, betraying his pact with Stalin, launched a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. Suddenly, Stalin's Soviet Union found itself fighting for its very survival against the Nazi war machine. Later that year, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The United States was now officially in the war. And just like that, these two ideological arch-rivals, the capitalist USA and the communist USSR, found themselves on the same side, united by a common enemy, the Axis powers. It was an alliance of necessity, not of love or shared values. As British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, another key partner in this grand alliance, famously said after Germany invaded the USSR, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The alliance was often awkward and mistrustful. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the Big Three, met several times at conferences like Tehran and Yalta to coordinate war strategy and discuss the shape of the post-war world. There were constant disagreements. Stalin demanded that the Western Allies open a second front in Western Europe to relieve German pressure on the Soviet Union's Eastern Front, where the vast majority of the fighting and dying was happening. The US and Britain eventually launched the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944, but Stalin felt it took too long. Despite the tensions, the alliance worked. Militarily speaking, the US, with its arsenal of democracy, supplied vast amounts of war materials, trucks, tanks, planes, food to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. This aid was crucial in helping the Red Army fight and eventually push back the German forces. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the Nazi war machine, suffering unimaginable casualties. Estimates range from 20 to 27 million Soviet citizens killed, military and civilian. The sheer scale of the fighting there tied down the majority of German divisions. Together, the combined might of the Allies, the US, Britain, the Soviet Union, and many other nations, gradually crushed the Axis powers. American and Soviet soldiers even met and celebrated at the Elbe River in Germany in April 1945 as the Nazi regime crumbled. Germany surrendered in May 1945, and after the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered in August 1945, ending World War II. This unlikely alliance had defeated a monstrous tyranny and saved the world from Axis domination. However, once the common enemy was gone, the deep ideological differences between the US and the USSR quickly resurfaced. The Grand Alliance fell apart, and a new, long, and dangerous period of rivalry began: the Cold War. But for a few crucial years, these two superpowers, who would spend the next 4 decades as adversaries, fought side by side in one of history's most pivotal and unlikely partnerships. Number 1. The deal with the devil that kicked off World War II. This one is a real mind-bender. On one side, you have Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler. The Nazis were fanatically anti-communist. Their ideology was built on racial hatred, extreme nationalism, and a deep, violent loathing of communism and the Soviet Union, which they saw as being run by Jewish Bolsheviks. Hitler had written extensively in his book Mein Kampf, about his plans to conquer the Soviet Union for Lebensraum, or living space, for Germans. On the other side, you have the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. The Soviets were the original communist state, dedicated to the idea of world revolution and the overthrow of capitalism and fascism. Nazi Germany was, in their eyes, the ultimate fascist enemy, the spearhead of capitalist aggression. For years, Soviet propaganda had denounced the Nazis in the strongest possible terms. These two regimes were, ideologically speaking, polar opposites and sworn enemies. They represented the two most extreme and mutually hostile political systems in Europe. Pact between them seemed unthinkable, a betrayal of everything each side claimed to stand for. Yet, in the summer of 1939, the unthinkable happened. On August 23, 1939, in Moscow, the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it was just an agreement that neither country would attack the other. Both sides pledged neutrality if the other was attacked by a third party. This alone was shocking enough to the world, which had watched Germany and the USSR trade insults and threats for years. The truly explosive part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was hidden from public view. It was a secret protocol, a secret agreement that effectively divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland was to be partitioned between them. The Soviet Union was also given a free hand in the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and parts of Finland and Romania. Essentially, Hitler and Stalin, these two bitter ideological foes, had secretly agreed to carve up their neighbors. Why would they do this? For Hitler, the pact was a strategic masterstroke. It meant he could invade Poland without having to worry about fighting a war on two fronts, against Britain and France in the West, who had pledged to defend Poland, and against the Soviet Union in the East. He believed Britain and France might even back down if the USSR was neutral. He always intended to invade the Soviet Union later, but this pact bought him time and secured his eastern flank for the immediate future. For Stalin, the motives were more complex. He deeply distrusted Britain and France, suspecting they wanted to push Nazi Germany into a war with the USSR while they stood aside. He may have hoped the pact would buy the Soviet Union time to build up its military strength for an eventual, inevitable clash with Germany. He also saw an opportunity to regain territories that Russia had lost after World War I, and to create a buffer zone of Soviet-controlled states on its western border. And, of course, he got a big chunk of Poland and influence over the Baltics without firing a shot, initially. Consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Just 1 week after the pact was signed, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France, honoring their commitments, declared war on Germany 2 days later. World War II in Europe had begun. As German forces advanced from the west, Soviet forces invaded Poland from the east on September 17th, taking their agreed-upon share. The Baltic states were soon occupied and annexed by the USSR. This cynical, pragmatic alliance between two totalitarian regimes that hated each other's guts paved the direct path to the deadliest conflict in human history. It showed the terrifying extent to which ideology could be tossed aside for short-term strategic gain. Of course, the pact didn't last. In June 1941, less than 2 years after signing it, Hitler betrayed Stalin and launched his invasion of the Soviet Union. The two former deeply unlikely partners became the most ferocious of enemies, locked in a titanic struggle that would claim millions of lives. But for that brief, dark period, their shocking agreement redrew the map of Europe and unleashed the horrors of global war.